Hello and welcome back to the Usage Report. I'm your host, Josh Shepardson, and you can follow me on Twitter where I post as @bchad50. And running backs are really the popular topic in this week's article. Oftentimes it's pretty 50-50 split between backfield situations and passing attacks, but this week a lot of running backs to discuss, a lot of running back situations to discuss, and it starts with Arizona and the Cardinals. David Johnson was expected to be the feature back, with Chris Johnson out for the remainder of the regular season and all but the Super Bowl, assuming he's even healthy enough then, or the Cardinals were to reach the Super Bowl. But Andre Ellington, dealing with turf toe, missed last week's contest, is expected to miss this Thursday's contest, so all eyes were on that Arizona Cardinals backfield, especially if you were the owner who was either lucky enough to have stashed David Johnson or nabbed him off the waiver wire. But as a rookie running back, there were some concerns that maybe Bruce Arians wouldn't trust him with the full workload, or maybe David Johnson wouldn't succeed. Neither of those things came to pass. Johnson played 59 offensive snaps. Kerwin Williams played 14. Stephan Taylor played 12. So it was very much in David Johnson's favor. Carried the ball 22 times. Kerwin Williams and Stephan Taylor totaled 11 carries. So Johnson doubled up his two backup backs. Johnson ran for 99 yards, also caught two passes and reached the end zone one time on one of those receptions. All in all, totaled 120 yards from scrimmage and looked excellent. Kerwin Williams was a nice change of pace back as well. He ripped off a long touchdown run on one of his 6 carries. Worth grabbing if you're in a 12-team league or larger and your bench is looking ratty. Not a bad move to grab Kerwin Williams, because if that injury lingers for Andre Ellington, there's always a possibility. I mean, David Johnson doesn't stay healthy. We've watched backs drop like flies this year. So any back that's looking even like they have more than a pulse, maybe they have a pulse and some talent like Kerwin Williams appears to, they're worth grabbing and rostering at this point in case injury crops up or productivity issues crop up and force Bruce Arians to move Kerwin Williams into a more prominent role. I mean, that offense is cooking, and grabbing any piece of it, especially a feature back in it, would be good. But David Johnson's that guy right now until Andre Ellington is healthy enough, at which time I would guess that it's probably more of a 50-50 split with Johnson and Ellington sharing time in that backfield in the true committee situation. Next up is the Chicago Bears, and 1 week after the backfield workload was split basically 50-50 between Forte and Langford, the scales tipped very much in favor of Forte this past week. 44 offensive snaps played for him, 28 for Langford, 21 carries for Forte to just 12 for Langford. Langford was the more productive back in terms of yards per carry. Forte totaled 84 yards, Langford totaled 59. And as expected, as I suggested last week, Forte was the more active pass catcher, caught all 5 of his targets. Langford still was targeted 3 times and did catch 2 passes. So both got a reasonable workload. Forte, with the scale tipping in his favor, now becomes an RB2 all over again. Was an RB1 before Langford's presence, but with Langford chipping into that playing time just a bit, I'm going to hedge here and say that Forte is more of a high-end RB2. But Langford, unless they decide to give him some more touches here down the stretch to get a look at him, really only a bench option, maybe an emergency flex or RB2 if you're really hurting it back. But most likely if you're in the postseason, you're not that badly beaten up. So Langford probably just a bench option at this point, not getting enough work to really trust. And Forte, again, his value sapped a little bit by the presence of Langford and Langford playing well, but definitely got an uptick in value this week after really just being a flex last week, since we didn't know how that backfield situation was going to shake out. Next up, we're going to look at another AFC North team, and that's Detroit Lions. Theo Riddick played 34 offensive snaps. Amir Abdullah played 20, and Joique Bell played 14. Amir Abdullah was by far the most productive runner and the back that got the most work. 13 carries for him for 67 yards. Joique Bell checked in with 8 carries for just 5 yards, and that continues to be the story for Bell this year. And then Theo Riddick did what Theo Riddick usually does. Only carried the ball 1 time for 4 yards, but was targeted 6 times in the passing game and caught 5 passes. So Theo Riddick's role is pretty obvious at this point. He's a pass-catching back. He's something of the Lions' Danny Woodhead. He's going to have a role in this offense. He's a young player like Amir Abdullah is, so you'd expect him to continue to get looks down the stretch. But with the Lions falling out of the playoff picture with their loss on the Hail Mary from Aaron Rodgers on Thursday Night Football last week. There's really no reason for them to continue to give Joyce Bell meaningful snaps. I mean, there is none. They know what he is at this point. It's time to evaluate some of their young talent, and if that turns out to be the case, Amir Abdullah should get some more looks, some more snaps. And if he and Riddick are splitting the snaps about 50-50, Amir Abdullah suddenly becomes a very interesting flex player, even a low-end RB2, thanks to his schedule the rest of the way. Faces the Rams this week. They were just carved up by David Johnson, as I mentioned above. And then he faces two even softer defenses in the last 2 weeks of the season. He gets just a beautiful schedule down the stretch. And coming off of his last two games, his two most productive rushing performances. I mean, he set a new career high 2 weeks ago in rushing yards, best of that last week. So he's trending in the right direction. If he can get 15 to 20 touches a game, which I think is very reasonable, even though we haven't seen that yet this year, I think now that the Lions are out of it, it's time to get him some touches and see what he can do, get him some experience, maybe get him a little bit less green, and get him ready for perhaps next year. He looks like a really strong flex play or RB2 for me. And he's a guy that I suggested in the Streamers and Waiver Wire podcast and article. So definitely get some Amir Abdullah. Green Bay, yet another NFC North team, but this is not a running back situation you want anything to do with. Starks played 33 snaps. Eddie Lacy played 19. And practice squad, Crockett played. Crockett was the most productive back, 22 yards on 5 carries. Eddie Lacy followed up his back-to-back good performances by rushing for 4 yards on 5 carries. So back to being the Eddie Lacy we've seen almost all season. Mike McCarthy spouting off about Eddie Lacy looking rejuvenated. I'm done with it. No more Eddie Lacy starting for any fantasy teams at this point. If you want to try them out there, good luck with that. But at that point, you get what you deserve. And if that's a 0 from Eddie Lacy, that's on you. This is not a backfield worth playing around with in the fantasy postseason. It's untrustworthy. You can't. And at this point, why would you take Mike McCarthy's word for anything? Eddie Lacy, they didn't say anything about the fact that he had broken some curfew rules and was in the doghouse before that game. So I'm done with that situation. There's no reason to use Eddie Lacy at this point. In fact, I see no reason to even roster him at this point because you can't trust him to start him. You might as well cast him to the wire and get somebody that maybe you could rely on if you had to insert somebody in a pinch. Next up is the Houston Texans. And finally, Alfred Blue's plotting earned him a demotion, really. Played just 9 snaps. Jonathan Grimes tripled him up in snaps with 27, and Chris Polk led the way with 30 offensive snaps. Blue carried the ball 4 times for 14 yards. That's a pretty standard Alfred Blue showing, but both Chris Polk and Jonathan Grimes both averaged over 5 yards per carry. Polk carried the ball 12 times for 61 yards. Grimes carried it 5 times for 28 yards. Polk was targeted 1 time, caught a touchdown pass. Jonathan Grimes targeted twice, caught both of his targets. Blue, not a receiving threat, wasn't targeted, didn't catch any passes. Blue had some flex value as a guy who's getting volume but wasn't going to do a lot. Now that it doesn't look like he's going to get volume, you can cast him aside. Chris Polk, I do think, is a worthwhile grab and stash on your bench if he continues to get the same kind of workload this week against the Patriots that he got last week against the Bills. Could emerge as a flex play or an emergency RB2 if you are hurting at the position. Can't really trust him yet since we haven't seen what Bill O'Brien's going to do with this backfield. I mean, it was a 50-50 timeshare basically with Polk and Grimes this past week. And, I mean, we're only a week removed from Alfred Blue being the bell cow in that backfield. So I can't really trust him yet, but at least Polk looked significantly better than Blues basically looked all year. He looked like a guy who has some life in that backfield. Kansas City Chiefs finally had 2 healthy backs, 2 of their healthy reserves behind Jamal Charles, who's lost for the season. Both Charkandrick West and Spencer Ware have looked great in feature duty, but we weren't really sure what to expect of the playing time situation, how they'd be used with both healthy, because both did shine as feature backs, but 2 very different runners. Charkandrick West played 34 offensive snaps. Spencer Ware played half as many, played 17, but the workload disparity not nearly as large. 9 carries for 35 yards Charkandrick West, 7 for 26 for Spencer Ware, 3 targets in the passing game that result in 2 receptions for Charkandrick West, 2 targets that result in 2 receptions for Spencer Ware. But the important thing here is Spencer Ware line work, and as the big, hard-charging runner that's kind of your classic goal line vulture, Ware should continue to get the goal line work. I think he has a higher floor, even though touchdown-dependent guys don't typically have that. The Chiefs' schedule lines up so that they should be in the red zone. They should have scoring opportunities. So I'm actually going to say Ware probably has a little bit higher floor than West. But West has the higher ceiling since he is capable of springing a long touchdown, and you'd expect him to dominate the yardage since he looks like the back that's going to get the bulk of the work between the 20s. At this point, both are flex-worthy, but tough to see either being an RB2 unless one or the other goes down or the playing time significantly shifts this week. But Chiefs big favorites this week. I expect both of them to get work against the really bad San Diego Chargers. Both are flex plays, at least in this matchup. Finally, at running back, we got the New York Jets, Chris Ivory and Bilal Powell. Bilal Powell outsnapped him again this week. 43 offensive snaps this past week. 43 offensive snaps for Powell, 30 for Ivory. Ivory was the more productive running back. As a runner, 10 carries for 47 yards. Powell, 6 carries for 17 yards. But Powell was the big receiving back. 13 targets, 8 receptions. Ivory, 5 targets, 5 receptions. And the targets and receptions are a little hot on the high side for Ivory. He has been used more in the passing game this year than typically, but Bilal Powell very clearly the receiving back in this bunch. Ivory's going to be game flow dependent. This week, the Jets are 7.5-point favorites against the Titans, so he does look like a middle tier RB2, but one with some downside, much lower floor than before, because if Mariota stays hot and the Titans race out to a big lead and beat the odds makers projection, then it's going to be Bilal Powell out there as pass catching back, and that's not good for Ivory owners. Bilal Powell's usage in the passing game makes him a defensible flex play in PPR leagues because he's going to catch some passes, and it looks like Ryan Fitzpatrick does like throwing the ball to him. So Powell flex play in PPR, Ivory and RB2, but keep an eye on those spreads down the stretch. If the Jets are projected to if Fitz goes down and Geno Smith is under center and they project to be underdogs in some of their contests, going to be hard to advise playing Chris Ivory because he's just not going to be on the field if they're playing catch-up. Moving on to the receivers, looking at another AFC East team, Miami Dolphins, and Jarvis Landry and Devontae Parker soaked up the bulk of the offensive snaps, 43 for each of them. The other receivers, Kenny Stills played 21 offensive snaps, Greg Jennings just 6. And they threw the ball just 19 times, so not a lot of targets to go around, but Landry targeted 5 times. Devontae Parker matched him in targets with 5. Parker was by far the more productive receiver. 3 receptions for him to 2 for Landry, but 63 yards for Parker, just 5 for Landry, and Parker caught the Dolphins' only offensive touchdown of the game. Parker's been put together back-to-back good games. You can't expect the Dolphins to be able to just air it out 19 times a game the rest of the season. So I like Parker stepping up as a nice flex play. Landry remains as the top pass-catching option, especially in PPR leagues. But it certainly hurts his stock a little bit to see the Dolphins running the ball as much as they are and trying very hard to limit Ryan Tannehill's pass attempts. But he is the clear-cut one there. You have a super deep team and you've got some alternatives. Most likely Landry's going to be in there, but Parker's the guy that I really want to discuss, and he's emerged as a nice flex play here down the stretch. Moving on to the New England Patriots, and they are a battered receiving core. Keyshawn Martin actually led the team in offensive snaps with 86. Brandon LaFell checked in with 84. Danny Amendola, 75. They continue to be a little bit more cautious with him. 75, not a small number by any measure, but they do seem to be trying to make sure he doesn't re-injure his knee or just get injured in general, since Danny Amendola has quite the track record of getting dinged up. And then a couple other guys here. Scott Chandler played 61 offensive snaps and delivered on the hype about him as a fringe tight end 1. 4 receptions, 61 yards, and a touchdown. But the guy that really turned some heads and really the the most productive receiver for the New England Patriots was running back James White, who caught 10 of 13 targets for 115 yards and a touchdown. He was excellent, really did a very nice Shane Vereen impression, I would say. And at this point, he needs to be rostered in 12-team leagues or larger. Running back is terrible. He definitely has a very low floor, since the backfield for New England is always a mystery. Sometimes they run the ball quite a bit with LeGarrette Blount. Other times they use Brandon Bolden. I mean, there's no guarantee that White's even going to play a ton of offensive snaps and get production. But, I mean, running back's been terrible. And if you've been bit by the injury bug and managed to win and get you, but still have some running back issues, James White is at least a decent dice roll, because that offense can move the football with Brady under center. And as long as Rob Gronkowski and Julian Edelman remain out, they're going to need somebody to step up next to Danny Amendola and even Scott Chandler as pass catching options. And White looks like he could be that guy. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers are another team with some wide receiving, I won't say issues, but things worth looking at. And while Mike Evans was a one-man show when Vincent Jackson was down and Austin Seferian-Jenkins was injured, he and Jackson have been sharing the looks from Jameis Winston, and Austin Seferian-Jenkins returned last week and threw his hat in the ring as well. Evans was targeted 7 times, ASJ was targeted 6, and VJax was targeted 5. So Winston willing to spread the wealth a little bit. Evans stock down just a tiny bit because he just isn't getting the volume that he was before, but remains in that wide receiver 2 territory. VJax wide receiver 3 flex. And this week at least, Austin Seferian-Jenkins is a fringe tight end 1. Thanks to facing the New Orleans Saints, no team allows more fantasy points per game to tight ends than the Saints. And the fact that he got 6 targets in his first game back after missing every game since week 2 are promising that he and Winston are on the same page, and Winston has trusted him even with that lengthy layoff. Not without risk, obviously, this week, but definitely a big target against a pass defense that just can't stop anyone. So all those guys look good this week. Finally, the Tennessee Titans are coming off of a shootout against the Jacksonville Jaguars, and Dorial Green-Beckham had his first 100-yard receiving game, played 41 offensive snaps, which was tied with Kendall Wright for the second most on the team. Harry Douglas played 49, but he was largely a non-factor. Targeted 3 times, 1 reception, 8 yards. But DGB was targeted 6 times, caught 5 passes for 119 yards and a touchdown. Delaney Walker continued to be awesome, 12 targets, 8 receptions, 92 yards and a touchdown. And the backup tight end, Craig Stevens, irritated anybody that had pass catchers in this game from the Titans by catching a touchdown as well. But DGB looked good, really looked the part of that freak receiver that is just a matchup nightmare. I've heard some talk that maybe Darrelle Revis, if he's back this week from his concussion, will be on Kendall Wright. But Wright plays a lot in the slot, so I'm not so sure about that. I think that you're going to see actually Revis matched up a bit with Dorial Green-Beckham, which is obviously bad for Green-Beckham's outlook this week. He does have upside as a big receiver here down the stretch, especially if he and Marcus Mariota remain on the same page. There's some fringe intrigue, I guess, if you absolutely have to use him as a boom or bust play, because the Jets do take away the tight end, and obviously Delaney Walker has been the number 1 option for Marcus Mariota. So if you have a gut feeling that they'll move DGB around and maybe he doesn't draw Revis for the bulk of this game, or it does leak that Revis is going to be matched up and shadowing Kendall Wright, or perhaps he's out again with his concussion, then DGB looks like a much better play. But I think that he's more of a bench option at this point. But I do think he's worth rostering because, again, if he and Mariota are on the same page here down the stretch, he can be a game changer as a flex option with his size, big red zone threat, and a big play threat coming off of his first 100-yard plus receiving game. So that's going to wrap things up for this week's usage report. Check out fantasyfootballcafe.com, where we've got some articles, more podcasts, and an active forum to help you win your contests and hopefully win your league this year. Till next week, good luck.